Welcome back to a lifetime of Mafia tales. Today, Sal and I talk about the 7th Mafia hitman Sal was close with. The name of the hitman was Anthony Rampino, also known as Tony Roach. Tony was an associate of the Gambino crime family underneath John Gotti. It is alleged that Tony was another hitman for none other than John Gotti himself. It is also alleged that Tony was involved with the murder/kidnapping of Frankie Gotti's killers and many more murders. Sal did a few criminal activities with Tony and would later find out that he was a vicious killer, which we go into detail about today. Tony was also a heroin dealer. He was also addicted to heroin as well. Tony would go on to serve the rest of his life in prison, and in 2010 he died a pretty miserable death. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this. Also, please subscribe to our Patreon if you want to get an exclusive story about Sal and Tony Roach. And without further ado, let's get into Tony's story. All right, Sal. Good morning, man. How you doing?
Good morning. Doing okay.
Good. Well, we got another episode for everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the next hitman that you had encounters with and stuff. His name was Tony Roach. He was an associate in the Gambino family. Now, do you want me to give a little background on what I researched, his upbringing and stuff, and we'll see where you fit in with this?
Yeah, you can do that. That'll make sense.
Okay. Yeah, so from what I read, I looked up that Tony was born in 1939 in Ozone Park. Tony would run the street with his brother. Growing up, Tony enjoyed playing stickball and basketball. He was a very lengthy man. From, even in the pictures, you could definitely tell that. I mean, this guy was huge. His hands were huge. I mean, he was just a tall guy. And he got his nickname from what, according to him, he said his nickname was from hitting a joint until there was nothing was left but a roach.
Right.
But he said, but other people, when other reports, they reported that they just said he looked like a roach, so they called him that. So I don't know what everyone's true, but he was an associate of the Gambino family, and he joined the mob. And Tony was a member of John Gotti's crew. And so Tony met Gotti in prison during the 60s. Gotti liked him because he thought he was quiet and he could trust him. So Tony became a collector for Gotti's crew when he came out, and he would later become a hitman. That's what I got from this upbringing. I mean, does that sound kind of fair to you?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, back in the 70s, you didn't share details of some of the stuff you did. So, he was definitely, enamored with John Gotti. He was actually a year older than Gotti because he was born in 39.
Yeah.
And what I remember was after I connected with Foxy and I would go to the Bergen, in the spring of 72, when the 4th of July came, the whole Gotti crew, the whole, club would participate in the softball game. And the thing about the game was you had Charlie and Danny Fatico, two brothers, and they would choose up sides who would play on Charlie's team and who would play on Danny's team. So one of the first picks either one of them would get would be Roach, Tony Roach, because he was really an exceptional athlete. I mean, he would play softball. He was like a vacuum at third base. It's more like Brooks Robinson, one of the great third basemen, for the Baltimore Orioles. And boy, he could hit. You could tell he was a terrific athlete. Probably took the wrong profession in being a criminal. He probably could have been a baseball player or a basketball player. So each year he would participate, 72, 73, 74. Those were the years that I went to the softball game that they had for all the guys that hung out at the club at the Bergen. As far as crime, I was not involved with him in crime, but he would show up after we hijacked the truck. I'd see him in the drop, the building where the merchandise was there, who would pick it up and he would help loading up. He was really what I called a Gotti lackey. He was a lackey. He was a guy who was amazed at John's personality, and he followed him, and he'd do anything that John Gotti told him to do.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's another guy like we talked about, Angelo Ruggiero. We're going to be talking about Peter Sicaro. and then Tony Roach now. I mean, there's a lot of guys that, even you were personally, talked to, had relationships. They were that. They just were so, fascinated about the, Gotti
Right.
character. So,
Exactly.
I mean, you didn't. I mean,
No, no, I didn't kiss up to Gotti because I wasn't assigned to him and he had no authority over me. And I was always protected by Cataldo because, in those days, a Colombo guy wasn't going to give up one of his best guys to another family. It just didn't happen in the 70s. So I watched what was going on. All I was interested in doing is, our next score, Foxy and I, the next score that we had going on. But I did see him in and around the Bergen. Occasionally, the whole Bergen crew would be led to another location for a crap game, and Tony Roach would be there. He didn't have much money, so he was a $5, $10 better. You know what I mean? He didn't. And when
no,
he came to Sinatra Club, I don't remember him really playing too much poker, but he'd show up. Guys would hang around. A lot of guys played poker there, but some guys didn't even care about poker. So I did see him for years in and around the Berg. And as far as what he did, I didn't really pay attention. I think he did, collect Shylock money for John or Gene Gotti. But as far as the details, I wasn't close with the guy. But I read a lot about him after I left the life, and obviously he got a lot of attention for being a vicious guy. I mean, for what was written, I think he was one of the backup shooters on the Castellano hit.
yeah, and that's what I read too. And it was because he was identified. Someone actually was able to identify him years later and say, hey, this is, the feds gave him a description and,
Yeah,
they went into their whole details and stuff. But I mean, they were able to actually point him as a backup shooter. He wasn't the guy that did it, but
yeah.
he was on the scene when it was going
You,
down.
you couldn't miss him. He was very unusual. I noticed today, looking around for pictures, they actually compared him to the guy in No Country for Old Men, that vicious guy that was the killer in that movie. He
Yeah.
sort of had an expression, or he could have a facial, appearance of looking like a sick killer. But he also had a jovial side to him. He was always laughing and carrying on. Whether or not he was high, I don't know. I mean, everybody knew that he was once a drug addict, and John sort of favored him, I guess, when they were in prison together. But I didn't know a lot about his background.
Yeah, well, and I'll throw some more stuff at you. You talked about him being a drug addict, and so that's something I read too. He was a heroin dealer, but he was also addicted to it. And I mean, he got clean off of it, like you said, and I believe maybe some of the mob guys sent him to treatment. Maybe Gotti or someone, to get him clean. But that's where he I don't know, but he ended up falling and after it and relapsing and stuff. But I mean, from what you noticed around being around him, I mean, did he seem kind of fidgety? Kind of, I mean, you wouldn't be able to point out one of these guys.
No, no, I mean, I didn't pay attention to his demeanor, and like I said, I was more involved with the crew, around Cataldo and the guys we did business with. My only connection there was with Foxy, and of course, I got to know Charlie and Danny Fatico, and I knew Gotti well, and all the guys that hung out there. I mean, I remember once reading some years ago that I think he got a long sentence for drug dealing, and there was rumor that he offered to give information,
Hmm.
about Gotti. I don't know how credible that was, but I guess he died. He died in jail.
Oh yeah, and we'll cover that as we go because I do have more information on that. But I was going to ask you as well. So from what I read was that he was close friends with John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and then these two we didn't really touch on was Nicholas Carrazzo and then Leonardo Di Maria. Did you ever hear of those two
Lenny
guys?
Di Maria, yeah, Lenny and Joey. They were two partners that were only 10, 15 blocks away. They were another part of the Gambinos who was sort of subservient to probably John. I don't think John liked those guys. They had their own crew. They had a bunch of sickos there, like Ronnie One Arm. I mean, they had all kinds of weird guys. It was only like 10, I would say maybe 20 blocks from the Bergen. They had a little club up there on maybe 78th Street, something like that, on 101st Avenue also. And they had their own little group who I think eventually most of those guys might have relocated to Florida. But they were also on the first Gotti Rico trial that I testified in. They were at the table with the other guys like Willie Boy and Angelo and John. They were also on that indictment.
So even what about Nicholas Carrazzo? Was he there with these guys too?
Yeah, he was on the case too. Nicky and Joey were both on that first Gotti racketeering case.
Oh,
But
okay.
I didn't know those guys real good. I mean, I
Mhm.
didn't associate with them. They were just a different part of the Gotti, or I should say, the Gambino family.
And that's what's strange. I suppose. I mean, hell, our country's divided and stuff. But I mean, even with these families, I mean, there's these internal beefs, and I mean, yeah, you're supposed to be underneath the same family and go with the same deal, be on the same side and same picture of
Yeah,
things. But that was not the case. A lot of things. I mean, a lot of other organizations, groups, legit things as well. But
yeah,
it's kind of weird how that works. But so that's what I was going to go into more about his background. So we talked about him being a drug addict. I mean, you didn't really notice that when he was around, and so I mean that's what was reported and stuff. But so Tony would help get rid of bodies as well as what was also reported. I mean, there was no specific details of a certain murder or any kind of thing like that, but I mean that was just another alleged thing that he was involved with.
yeah. From what I heard from some of the law enforcement guys after I got to know those guys years later, was I think he might have been involved in the abduction and maybe the murder of the guy that killed Gotti's son. I don't remember that guy's name. Um anyway, he lived in Howard Beach and he worked at a furniture company or something. And from what I heard, he might have been the guy that clubbed that guy. I don't know. Do you remember his name? The guy that was disappeared who killed Gotti's kid.
No, but I wrote down. I said, so in 1980, John Gotti's son Frankie was killed. He was hit by the man that did it, and then
Right.
Tony is believed to be one of the guys that helped kidnap and get rid of the body.
Yeah.
So and of course John Gotti was in Florida when it happened. So then
Right. Right.
Tony was the crash car driver really as well. So I don't know. I mean, like I said, it's all alleged, so there's nothing that we can really pinpoint on him. But the feds, I mean, they believe that he was involved with it. So
Yeah.
I mean,
Gotti recruited some strange. I call them strange birds. I mean, they were odd. It's like strange birds like Redbird, Robert Gomes, and then Tony Roach. These guys were lifetime criminals who were in and out of jail forever, and he used them. I mean, they followed Gotti like he was Al Capone. I mean, that's what they did. I know. Last night I took a quick look at the at the out. I'm sorry, at the Anthony Ruggiano interview with Sammy Gravano.
oh, did
And
you?
yeah, I never look at that stuff, but there's a lot of information that's pretty accurate,
Uh huh.
whether or not they color it or they exaggerate. But they talked about some of the stuff that Gotti did and how he changed. I wasn't around Gotti after 1982, is when I moved upstate New York, and I was up there a couple of years before I got busted. But from what I understand, the way Gravano talks about the stuff that Gotti did and the stuff that Anthony Reggiano was around, he had turned into another person. I mean, I think he really became an egotistical, narcissistic guy. And so it was interesting listening because I knew the young John Gotti, 1972, 73, 74. But I remember him recruiting all these strange characters out of prison. I mean, I was in prison with a guy named Arnold Squattieri, Big Arnold. He was in Lewisburg the same year I was. And Arnold was a total drug dealer. And he wound up, being involved with Angelo. I guess they had a drug connection and all. But Gotti recruited all these odd people that were really strange. And Tony Roach was probably the strangest looking guy.
Well,
Really.
describe his appearance.
Well, he could have been scary looking. He looked like a cross between, I don't know, Herman Munster and a scary, you know, character on television or in the movies. You know, you'd look at him, he could make some strange faces, and he didn't intimidate me. He was easy to get along with. I mean, he wasn't very bright. I would say he was one of the guys I would call around Gotti. I gave a description of some of the guys. I'd say he was not exactly 100-watt bulb.
Yeah, so he wasn't
No,
fully lit.
no, not too
No.
bright. No, but I'm sure he would do anything that Gotti asked him to do. So
Right.
that was his function, and sort of like a bodyguard or something, always protecting John. And as the years went by, I think John secluded himself more and more from what, I mean, I wasn't around there in 85, 6, 7, whenever, after everything went down. But I guess, the government wiretaps and information from all kinds of guys like Mikey Scars and all that, they gave a lot of detail about what was going on inside the life. So for Tony Roach, he sort of just lived off nickels and dimes that Gotti threw him.
Mm-hmm. You brought up the faces, and that's something I read, but I didn't write it down. I mean, what faces did he make? Like,
I don't know, like sort of distorted, scary looking expressions. I
he would
guess
just do that randomly?
yeah, I guess he tried to, use that as a trademark of scaring people. I guess he picked up some of the loan shark money, whether he worked for, I think he was also around Gene Gotti a lot too.
Oh, yeah, I would imagine if he would have been close with the Gottis and stuff like that, he would have been close with the brothers as well,
Yeah,
Gene and
yeah,
Peter Gotti probably. But
that whole group. Yeah, I mean, when I hung out at the Bergen, Peter Gotti would stop by in his New York City garbage
uniform?
uniform.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the garbage man. That's what I knew about Peter Gotti. And then, of course, in maybe 77, 78, I recruited his kid, Peter Jr., to play football on my team. So I would see Peter. But as far as him being a tough guy or a gangster, I never saw that with Peter Gotti. He just sort of fell in and followed, John Gotti's footsteps. It was
Mhm.
pretty interesting that they claimed that he was the boss of the family. I could never envision that in my life.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Tony had his encounters with him too, or he probably would have had his opinion on it. But
Yeah.
Tony, he was never made. I'm not fully sure why, but maybe because he was a drug addict. Maybe they knew he was
Probably
selling.
so. That they might have been frightened that he was going to flip
Mhm.
eventually. And I heard at the end of his life, there was some rumor that he offered information.
Yeah, and there was even this thing that again you brought up Sammy. So it was alleged by Sammy that John Gotti wanted to kill, get rid of the Roach. He said we need to take care of our Roach problem. Is
Oh,
how
really?
how he
Oh,
phrased it. But they
oh.
never act on it. But I'm not too sure. I'm sure it was because he was probably getting wild with drugs and all that. Maybe I.
Yeah, I mean, just the example of the way he treated Angelo at the end of Angelo's life. He just bailed out of all these people. I mean, he used everybody, as little pawns, like a chess game, and that was John. It seemed that was John's mo. While he was at the end of his reign, which was, he after the Rico case that I testified, which was '87, he was acquitted. He had about 4 or 5 years on the street where he got away with all kinds of stuff, Gotti. But he did have this group of strange guys, following him, protecting him, and that's what he did. He plugged all these guys into little jobs. He gave them these little menial jobs and made sure they had a few bucks in their pocket. But that was the way he controlled all these guys.
Yeah, and the thing is too, I did do some research on this. On he was in 1986. Tony was indicted with John Gotti, Gene Gotti, and Willie Boy for the RICO trial. So this is probably the one that you're talking about, where you
Right,
testified in
right,
1987. So
right.
the follow up information I had on that was that Sammy the Bull alleged to help beat this case by paying off the juror members, they were all
Right.
acquitted because,
Yeah.
I mean, this is definitely the one that you're talking about. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the same case that Charles Caniglia never showed up on, and had a conviction came down. He would have been convicted in absentia, but he was actually acquitted. So then he came out of the closet and went back on the street and did all kinds of stuff after the 1986-87 case.
yeah. And another thing, too, is like, I mean, did you testify on Tony? Do you remember him being in the courtroom?
I don't exactly remember. He might have been there. God, there was such a lineup there. If he was on the indictment, I mean, I testified. I didn't think I had much information about him, just that he
No.
was, yeah, he was sort of a gaudy lackey. That's what he did, and hung around the club waiting for something to happen.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would imagine that maybe they only brought to court that day, maybe the guys that you actually gave information on, because like even in this show, you didn't talk about doing a whole lot of direct crime with him, but
No,
I mean, you knew him, but we just wanted to cover it because the fact that he was one of these killers that you knew.
right, right,
And so, after that case, he got out with the whole Sammy the Bull getting him out because they paid off the jurors. He would, be on the street, and I think, a year later, he was busted for selling drugs. He offered he was offered to become an informant, but it never happened. So he got 20 plus years in prison for this. So he was arrested for selling $30,000 worth of heroin to an undercover police officer in Ozone Park, Queens. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for the criminal sale of controlled substance in the first degree, which carries a sentence of 15 to life in prison. His bail was set at 150,000. That's from when I got off of a document.
yeah. I'm sure. Let's see, that was 87.
Yeah, just a year after.
So I'm sure he had some connection to Angelo.
Okay, so they were doing it together, you think?
I'm sure that because Angelo, definitely was in the drug business, and I mean that guy I mentioned, Arnold Squitieri, was a big time heroin dealer, and I was in prison with him in '74. So by the time the '80s came, he was in and out of prison, but I think he was under John Gotti at the time when John took over the whole family after the Castellano assassination. And I bet that it would be my idea that Roach was getting drugs from Angelo because that's what Angelo was doing. He was in the drug business.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not too far fetched because they're under the same family, under the same crew.
Right.
So, whether they let Gotti know or not, I mean, they were
Yeah.
doing it. And I mean, they still were kicking up money. And
Right.
John was kicking up to Neil, and Neil was kicking up to Paul. So,
Yeah.
they weren't supposed to be doing that, but they
Uh,
took that risk there and went on and did it. But I mean, he got busted for it. So,
yeah.
he ended up spending the rest of his life in prison. So,
I know he didn't have a car. He just didn't. He didn't have any assets. He didn't have any income, so he was totally reliant upon the whole Gotti connection. That was Roach's, part of his life was, being around John Gotti. I mean, don't forget he met Gotti before anybody ever heard of John Gotti. So, they had some kind of symmetry between them, and they were involved, like I said, in crime. But whether or not, Gotti knew exactly all he was doing, I mean, he probably knew he was a drug addict at one time, but he had this likable personality. He really did.
well, maybe that's why, maybe he would find these guys in prison and he
Yeah.
would feel he could trust them on a certain level because, I mean, why would there be an informant or some kind of fed in just in prison, spending
Yeah.
day to day after, so I mean, that's like you said, I mean, that's where he found Tony and they went on to commit all kinds of crimes together. And I mean, I don't, what year would that it have even been when he would have met him in prison the first time? I mean,
Well,
that was after
let's see.
McBratney, right?
Gotti went to jail in '75 on the McBratney case, but
Yeah.
Gotti also was in Lewisburg in the early '70s. Like he got out when 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 I met Angelo in prison, because we had already spent a couple of years at the Sinatra Club. So Gotti had gotten out before. Oh, that's right. He got out in 72 and came to the Sinatra Club. So Gotti probably met Tony Roach. Yeah, he probably met him in 71.
Yeah,
He came right
and
out to he was at the Bergen also in 72, 73, 74.
oh, okay. So you recall Tony being around
Yeah,
in those early years. Okay, so
right.
yeah, that's probably where that's got to be where he met him if that was his first
Yeah.
prison sentence like
And
that.
that's what it said. He met him. I don't think Gotti was in jail in the 60s. I believe maybe 69, 70, 71. I think
Yeah,
that was a hijacking
yeah,
charge. I think, and Gotti was in Lewisburg before I got there. And then he got out in 72. And then we all went back to Lewisburg, Angelo, myself, John Caniglia was there in 72, I'm sorry, 74. So in and out, you meet these guys in prison. And then Gotti was recruiting guys and he was building a whole army,
yeah,
by the time he got out in 72.
yeah. And then I think that in our first show we did about these hitman, John Gotti was the first one, and we talked about him doing that hijacking and getting busted with it with Angelo, and that was you know, their first prison sentence for some kind of mob related charge.
Right, right.
So yeah, that that's definitely got to be when it was. So then, I mean, after that, he probably knew he was going to start his own crew. He was going to do this and that, and so he probably ran into Tony. He's like,
Yeah,
"Wow, perfect.
yeah.
This guy's scary looking, so let's bring him in." And he seems like a quiet, secretive guy. So let's bring him in and see what he can do.
I kind of remember the summer of 72 or 73. We were all at the Bergen and Delacroix shows up. And it must have been around lunchtime because there was this parade. A bunch of guys like John and Angelo were in the front of the group walking arm in arm with Delacroix. And then there was Jeannie, and I don't know, it might have been Roach walking with him. And then there was me and Foxy in the back following along. We went to this restaurant. The restaurant was called Guatuccio's Restaurant. It was a small little restaurant a few blocks from the Bergen. And we all went there and had lunch. And, we sort of honored Delacroix for showing up. And then I told Dominic about it, and he said, well, you really shouldn't be, in this procession with the rest of these guys. You're not part of that crew. So after that, if I saw Delacroix, there or everybody would know when he was coming, I would just make like I had to split, had to leave, because I couldn't show this guy too much respect. I wasn't with that crew,
Well, hell, I
But
mean, as many stories as you got, you might as well have been
yeah,
about the Gambino guys. I mean,
yeah,
there's so much. I mean, that was kind of your areas, though. I mean, you were doing a lot of stuff with the Gambinos and
yeah,
the Columbos with Dominic, and
yeah.
a little bit with the Bonanos and Genovese. Not too much, but which one am I missing? Another five. Lucchese's, yeah, Paul
Case,
Vario, Henry Hill, Tommy.
Mario, yeah,
Yeah, so I mean, you got quite a few stories with a lot of these guys. So being an associate, it lets you have more leeway. I feel like of
yeah.
guys you can work with. Is that would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, you were developing contacts, all kinds of contacts. I mean, what information came from guys on the street that because there was a lot of times where guys would show up, they'd want to give information on a potential heist, and then they would be ignored by Angelo and John and all. Maybe they didn't think they were credible, they didn't trust them or something. But the information that we had was between Cataldo, Jimmy Burke, and Paulie Vario, who had deep connections to Kennedy Airport. And also the Faticos, they had people that worked in the cargo area that were gambling customers, loan shark customers. And these were the people that gave information on valuable truckloads of merchandise that worked its way over to the whole Gotti crew.
Yeah. So I mean, they would be getting a lot of these heists and information from,
Right.
say, associates or say bookmakers or guys that would come in
Yeah.
trying to pay a debt,
Yeah. Yeah.
and because they couldn't pay it with cash.
Yeah. I do know that our attorney, Mike Corio, I believe he represented Tony Roach on some kind of a case. I mean, he might have had a minor criminal case pending. So Mike Corio was always in and out of that Bergen. I saw a surveillance photo, and there he was at the front door, and there was all kinds of people there. So I believe Tony Roach got a little representation from Mike Corio, who was more of a wise guy friend than an attorney. Eventually, he got snared and got convicted and went to jail. And he never opened up his mouth. He was involved with all kinds of stuff with the Gotti crew and the Gambinos. Also, Cataldo had a hold on Corio because Cataldo was represented by Mike Corio in the '60s, long before John and Gene Gotti used him.
Yeah, so I mean, Dominic, I mean, he must have put him on to, this attorney. I don't know. I mean, if you really think about who had it before Dominic.
I don't know. Cataldo had some good attorneys back in the '60s because he faced a couple of federal charges for counterfeiting or a stock fraud or something like that. But as far as I knew, I met Corio maybe in '69 when I got busted for bookmaking. Every couple of weeks, I was getting busted for bookmaking. So he represented me on that. And by that time, 70, 71, I realized that he also represented Angelo early on.
Did you ever hear any of the other guys' opinions on Tony Roach?
Not really. I think I think they really figured that he was being respected by Gotti as a guy that was close to him, and that he was okay, because that was like the seal of approval. If you were hanging out with Gotti and he made you feel like you were important, and that's what John did. He made everybody feel important. Then they just accepted Roach, like Willie Boy Johnson. But at the same time, Willie Boy Johnson was undercover informant for the feds. So, God, that must have been a terrible piece of news that they realized that he was giving information for, I don't know how many years, 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, long time. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, you think people go undercover, they do not. I mean, you necessarily think a guy's gonna flip. I mean, like in your case, you're only around for a couple months and you're out of there, But
Yeah.
some of these guys stay in years and years and years, man. I don't know. They make a career out of it. I don't. I
Yeah.
have no clue the thinking on it or why, but it's pretty dangerous, man. It's really dangerous.
Oh yeah. Eventually, there was ways that guys like Corio, who had contacts in the court system, found out about who was giving information, and eventually these guys, probably most likely, a lot of them disappeared, wound up in the back seat of a Subaru, crushed up.
Yeah. I mean, it is pretty insane how it all went down like that. But I mean, there's so many of these stories and so much history that we see like that.
I don't remember Gotti making fun of Roach the way he made fun of Willie Boy. I mean, they really made a lot of insulting remarks about Willie Boy being an Indian, and that was their way of, having a little sense of humor. But Roach, he didn't get that type of disrespect. I think he was a scary guy, and people knew that in a drop of a moment, Gotti could ask him to kill somebody and he'd go kill him. I mean, I never heard much about what he really did, intimately or secretly. I didn't hear that. But he was always there whenever John, needed him, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, he was just another one of his right hand man.
Yeah.
But before Tony, where we kind of were at with Tony, he went to prison. Like I said, he was convicted. He got basically life in prison because he would end up dying in, I believe, 2010. Yeah, he died from cancer. But even before he died, he was given the opportunity to maybe be resentenced. So we went to a meeting, and from the report, they said that he was in a wheelchair and he was shaking, and he was just asking to be let out. He's an old man, sick, ready to be let out. But they basically told him, they said he might not be able to do hijackings no more, but he could still consider to do crimes. So then they just left it at that, and he ended up dying in there.
Yeah. He didn't live a nice life. I mean, for sure, being a drug addict. Don't forget, he was probably a drug addict in the '60s, because if he was born in '39, he was 20, 21, 22 years old in the early '60s when drugs was really secretive. I mean, you got to realize how secretive the drug uh, culture was in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah,
So,
and it had a. I mean, drugs have never been clean, but especially when something new comes out, it couldn't have been worth the worth the crap at
yeah,
all. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
I'm sure Angelo was taking advantage of his loyalty to John, and maybe pushing heroin to Tony Roach to go sell it. How in the world he got caught selling $30,000 worth of drugs to an undercover, police officer? I don't know. Like I said, he wasn't exactly a bright guy. He
Yeah,
needed to be led around.
yeah, and I would have liked to see more information on that, or on the whole, being busted. I mean, that would have been interesting, but I couldn't really find anything. But maybe, we can, maybe someone else can find some documents and
Yeah.
comment in and then send us a link or something.
Yeah, you
But
get this podcast out there. It's amazing. Like I said, I see people who knew lots of little bits and pieces of information. I'm sure someone's going to respond to who Tony Roach was, that maybe they had a relationship with him.
oh, I'm sure we get all
Yeah,
kinds of crazy, interesting stuff like that, and
yeah,
on especially our Tommy video, Henry Hill. I mean, these guys, Jimmy Burke. I mean, people have stories from back,
right.
when they were in clubs or restaurants or whatever the hell it may have been, family related to them. I mean, and these guys were well known. That's for damn sure.
Yeah,
And another final thing that was going on with Tony, I guess it was after the fact that he had died, but his son. This was like the last part of history that I've ever seen of Tony. But his son was busted for a DUI. He was driving like 100 miles an hour with six girls
really.
in the car. Yeah,
Wow.
so they just kind of said he was wild like his dad, but who knows? Maybe it was like a one-time thing, and he got busted. But I never heard anything else after that. I couldn't find any information on Tony, or that
I
kind of
didn't
died.
even know he had a son.
I guess from the reports that I read, I mean, there's
Yeah,
multiple of them saying this, so
yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it is. But I mean, like I said, I wanted to add into towards the end of our shows, as well as to really talk about these this whole redemption aspect of it. I mean, who knows? I mean, you were close with Tony. I mean, he was a straight killer. I mean, if you would have got on Gandhi's wrong on bad side or something at a certain point in time, maybe he would have had Tony come after you. He could have been someone. You know what I mean? I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know. And it's this is definitely these stories. They're not to be glamorized or anything like that, but they're like a horror story, really, because I mean, you describe him being a scary looking guy and stuff when
Yeah.
he was a killer. So
Yeah.
people could have really a lot of people probably feared him. You know what I mean? When you were here
I'm
playing.
sure. I don't know what I don't know what Sammy Gravano had to say about him, but I'm sure he was all around that whole time period when they killed Castellano. So he was there. As far as the reports were, he was a backup shooter. That was interesting, that Gotti trusted him enough to be part of that hit.
Yeah, because that was a very big deal, taking out your old boss and then
Yeah. And
becoming
I
the boss.
and I did listen to Sammy explaining what went on and what his part of that hit on Castellano was the other night when I listened to Anthony
Anthony.
Ruggiano. He was sharing information, but then Sammy also was letting out little negative bits and pieces of who John became, getting involved with I don't know, a woman that was part connected to Delacroix and all this kind of stuff. So whether this stuff was true or not, I think Sammy at the end got very bitter on John. So, they were both caught on wiretaps talking about each other. So that's
Hmm.
how the whole uh, conflict, developed and continued. And by the time that Sammy flipped, I think he felt that Gotti was interested in killing him. At the same time, I think Sammy entertained the idea of killing Gotti. So, it was the classic example of a whole, crime ring,
Yeah.
being dismantled. And the government was right in the middle listening to it all. That's what I thought was, fascinating, because, the whole Gotti crew and all that, they underestimated the power of the government, really.
Yeah, no, they did, and You think about these guys, they could have really been anything they wanted to. I mean, they were smart. If they would have just stayed on the legit side, they could have
Yeah,
done a lot. I mean, even in Tony's case, Tony Roach, he could have been a sports athlete. I mean, you don't have to be
yeah,
wise to do that, but I mean, he could have, been in baseball or basketball, like you said. I mean, he was tall, he was good at it. I mean, a lot of things could have changed if he was probably in a different environment, different
yeah,
area, not around these guys. I mean, that's a major factor, and poverty and all that other kind of stuff is factors into a lot of these guys going into that life, or even having fathers, uncles, anybody that could be involved with it, grandfathers and stuff. So they kind of see it as something. No, this is just family business. This is just cool, but
yeah,
I mean, this is not definitely not a life that you should go down. I mean, even if you're able to avoid it somehow. I mean, it's definitely. I mean, because like I said, it's the environment, not
yeah,
necessarily like the whole mafia stuff, but it could be gangster stuff. Other gangs, other criminal
yeah.
organizations and stuff. I
But if
mean,
you look at Roach, who was born in '39, in the '60s, the mob had this glamorous appeal to a lot of people. So him getting involved with Gotti and seeing, the connections that Gotti had, that was an uplifting experience for him. He had something to hold on to, sort of like a cult. When you get involved with a cult, and him hanging on to Gotti, John Gotti, Gene Gotti, Angelo, they were pretty much looked at as players in the Gambino family. So that was the time, like I said, there was a lot of glamour attracted to any mob life. Of course, it quickly became clear that it wasn't a life that was a beautiful life. So many people were getting killed, and so many people were dying in jail. I don't know. I guess there's a lot of guys that once they got so deep into it, they couldn't turn their back and walk away without, without becoming a confidential informant, or what everybody called as a rat. They were scared to death to do that kind of stuff. So they were stuck in the life. Once they got stuck in there, they, like Roach, they couldn't get out.
yeah, and that's what I think too. A lot of guys, a lot of people join when they're kids, of course, or they become teenagers, and they get groomed into it essentially, and then they keep going in, they get further, they commit their first crime and then a murder or whatever it may be, and then now they're really in it, and so now they feel
Right,
like there's no way to get out, like you said. So
right.
I mean, at that point, there's got to be some kind of turning point to where they can, you would think that they'd be able to push back, even easily, try to easily retire from the rackets, but I don't know. I mean, there's got to be some kind of ways that towards the end of each of our shows, we can, give a little bit an understanding on why it's so hard to get out of that life, or how can people not join that life. And we'll use like we did today, we used Tony Roach as being an example of,
Yeah,
on how he glamorized it and why. Like, I really want to understand why they get involved with that. So, the next one we'll be talking about maybe Peter Seguro. We'll try to
yeah,
understand what,
yeah,
what what behavior led him to join that life. And I mean, I think yeah, we covered the mafia history and everything like that. That's really cool. But I really want to understand and how we could prevent other people in the future from joining these criminal organizations, or maybe even help them get out. I don't know.
there's a certain amount of glamour that guys like Gotti pervade. The way he dressed, the way he talked, the way he walked, and he had all these people following him. He was like the Pied Piper. So a guy like Roach, what other prospects did he have after getting out of prison? Really?
Right. Especially being addicted to
Yeah,
drugs, growing
yeah,
up in the
yeah.
street.
And where did he get $30,000 worth of heroin? No one has ever explained where that heroin came from. I'm sure it came from Angelo, you know, and Angelo was, they trusted him. So Angelo was doing all the dirty work behind John's back. And, once his brother got killed in the airplane crash, Angelo was deeply entrenched in the heroin business.
Yeah, and so it was pushed off to him and
Yeah,
anyone that he could find that would help him sell the junk. I mean,
right,
so
right,
that's probably what definitely could happen. It sounds like the
right.
most legit thing, you know.
Yeah,
But we'll switch over to our Patreon channel now. But For anybody that wants to hear a follow-up story about
Yeah.
Tony Roach, just go over there. All of our Patreon subscribers, you can check us out over there. But Sal, our show's been doing pretty well, and me and you, I know we both appreciate everybody that's been commenting and
Yeah.
subscribing over to Patreon and supporting the books or anything that we can, sell. I mean, people have, been supportive, so it's cool to see the reaction we're actually getting on these videos. It's pretty
Right.
cool. You got anything you want to add into that?
No, when I think about Tony Roach, I think that he was just a guy that was caught up following, the charismatic Gotti, and then he couldn't turn back.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we'll end on that and we'll switch over to Patreon. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
That wraps up the 7th Hitman, Anthony Tony Roach Rampino. Tony is an example of someone who got wrapped up in the criminal life and had a horrible outcome. Please comment any key takeaways that you got from this interview. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel if you want more videos from us. Also, please be sure to subscribe to our Patreon if you want to hear that exclusive story about Tony Roach and Sal. We got more stories on there as well, so when you sign up and become a member, you get full access to those. If you would like to get an autographed book of Sal's book, The Sinatra Club, you can get that in the video description. Also, you can buy the Sinatra Club playing cards. These playing cards were played with by Sal, John Gotti, and even Tony Roach. They can be found in the video description below. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.